And so emergence and progression, as I said, are important concepts for game designers to be familiar with when thinking about the gameplay that they're working on. And they're terms that they're kind of like big words for things that you guys are going to be pretty familiar with just from being gamers in general. But let's talk about what they mean and how we can use them in game design. So emergence and progressions are two aspects of creating systems for gameplay. And this kind of goes back a little bit to what we've been talking about really since the very first week of class when we first started talking about things like obstacles and rewards and goals and things like that, as well as game mechanics and how these things fit together. So emergence and progression are terms for like the kind of like style of these systems. Emergence refers to gameplay that involves simple rules with open-ended results. And so the gameplay emerges out of the rules. That's where the word emerge comes from. So we have like a little kind of like sandbox of rules, and the rules create the conditions for the gameplay, and the sort of arc or experience of the game emerges from that sandbox. So that's emergence. Progression, on the other hand, is a predefined order of challenges. So progression is when there may still be like rules about how the game works, but there's like a predefined, like you have to jump from A to B and B to C and go through these challenges or these story components. And so in a progressive game or a game that uses progression, the arc or experience of the game is determined more by the level design or the progress that you make through the game. And so most video games are using both of these concepts and both of these systems together in various different ways. And we'll talk about some examples of when they're being combined or when we might notice them in different contexts. So starting with emergence, a chess is a very good example of an emergent game system. You can see the chessboard here, and it's very defined. There's defined boundaries, there's defined rules, and there's defined pieces. All of the different elements of the game are right there in front of us, and they're always the same, and they always kind of start in the same place. And so this is a classic example of an emergent game where the sort of experience of the game or the gameplay is determined by the choices of the individual players. Games like The Sims or other simulation games are also emergent, so you don't know what the ending is going to be when you start the game. Another example of this is just like sports in general, like any sports, any game in the real world, not even just sports, but really most card games or board games, things like that are going to be emergent. So there's a bunch of rules and there's players, and you sit down and you don't know who's going to win, and that's what makes the game fun, is that multiple players are playing within the system and trying to use the rules to their advantage and figure out how to defeat their opponent. So any kind of like physical game, any kind of card game, poker, hearts, all those kinds of games that you play with other people or against a computer, even solitaire and Minesweeper, which Nancy mentioned in her post, those are also emergent games. Anything that you don't know how long it's going to play or what the result is going to be at the end. So The Sims is a good example of this. You kind of start with a blank canvas, and there's rules for how you can populate that canvas. And part of the fun of the game is building up your environment and your world and seeing where it goes, where your choices lead to. So the basic tenets, simple rules that are combined into complex systems. Each gameplay will be different from the previous games. And typically, emergent games are hard to master. So you're going to play them over and over again. And the more times you play them, you'll get better at them because you'll understand the variations of what can happen within the set of rules. So for a designer making an emergent game, there's a lot of attention paid to the effect of small changes in structure or systems of rules. So if you're designing a board game, you're going to start out with a few basic rules, and you're going to play the game and see, is it fun? Is it hard? How long does it take? And you may have some certain goals in mind, like some games are intended to take 10 minutes or 15 minutes, while other games are meant to take several hours. So you have these kind of goals, and then you will play through your game to test to see what the result of those rules is. And an emergent game will typically have a strategy guide rather than a walkthrough. So there's no walkthrough for a game of chess. There's more strategy, like this is one opening that you might do.
Yeah, it won't burn. Just give me a minute, please.
Richard, do you have a question? Or?
No, they need to be flipped. Can you turn them 180 degrees? Thank you.
Okay. So here's an example of a strategy guide for the game Pokemon. I'm sure a lot of you guys have played Pokemon, and you're familiar with the emergent properties of this game, where there's lots and lots and lots of different possibilities for any specific gameplay. And what makes the game fun is trying to kind of...
They're chicken parm wraps.
Richard, I'm going to mute you. Okay. So what makes Pokemon really fun is the great complexity of the gameplay, and trying to kind of figure out how to play the game through intuition and knowledge and experience and all these different factors that are kind of combined together. Okay, so typically in emergent games, the playthroughs are going to be short. So most games like chess or poker or things like that, the gameplay is going to be short. This is relative to other types of video games. So short, maybe half an hour or an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Something that you could do in a day or in a sitting, as opposed to a progressive game, which may take 20 hours or 30 hours for certain types of like RPGs and stuff like that. Yes, strategy guides were important before the internet. And now it's, the version of that we have now is just being able to watch other people play or see things online and stuff like that. Emerging games are also more likely to have an audience. So, if you're really good at playing Overwatch or Call of Duty or something like that, you may stream your game and people will watch. And, they're probably not going to watch if you're playing a game that has a narrative, because they're going to want to experience the narrative for themselves. They're more likely to watch a game that involves a lot of skill and mastery and variation, from the base sort of rules. So that's why we have audiences at chess matches and soccer games, and now we have esports where lots of people. I think I have image of the Overwatch finals, which was in Brooklyn at the Barclays Center in July 2018. And so you have a big audience because you don't know what the outcome is going to be in an emergent game. So within that context, in an emergent game, the goals are formed by the individual players rather than being set by the game designer. So the game designers will typically have certain goals in mind, like they have end states, but the goals for the players are kind of internal. You may have goals to, beat the game very quickly or be the #1 ranked player. Those are external goals that come from the rules that are set up by the designers. And typically in an emergent game, the outcome has to be greater than the sum of its parts. So, a game can be really, really simple. Like Tetris is a good example of a game that it has, a few basic shapes and a few basic rules about how you can manipulate those shapes. And from that, lots of different possibilities emerge. And, people have played countless hours in with those basic rules. So winning conditions are created by the designers rather than like a specific goal. So in a game like Mario, you have a specific goal, which is to reach the end of the level. In an emergent game, we don't really know when the game is going to end. So we create end conditions. So in Monopoly, the ending condition is when everybody in the game has gone bankrupt except for one person, and that person, is the winner. But depending on how long the game is going for and other conditions, the players might decide, the first person out is we will end there or something like that. So the players kind of also have some input as to exactly what the winning conditions might be. Monopoly. So within emergent gameplay, challenges are very important. We need good positive feedback. In computer-based systems like multiplayer video games, they often use handicapping as a way of kind of balancing players to make the game more competitive and more interesting. So rubber banding is a good example of this. Like in Mario Kart, if you're behind one of the main players, you can shoot weapons forward. So if you're in a losing position, you have a sort of advantage that the person ahead of you doesn't have. So this kind of balances the competition, and using this type of game mechanics makes the game more interesting. But there's also like besides the sort of like known game mechanics, there's also unknown sort of like balancing that happens just within the system itself. So Mario Kart is an example. A lot of people have done studies of this where they show that the person who's in the lead will often slow down at various parts of the track. And so this is the computer kind of like actually changing the conditions of the game in order to balance the gameplay. So that's something that couldn't happen in a physical game like soccer or chess. But in a video game system, you can add in sort of these hidden handicapping or rubber banding effects that make the game more balanced. So challenges are built around interactions with other players. This usually requires multiplayer or sophisticated AI that can imitate human actions. So if you're playing against the computer, and there's desirable and undesirable effects of emergent gameplay. So undesirable effects are exploitations of the rules for unintended advantages. So in video games, a lot of time that's finding a glitch or finding something, finding a secret glitch in the game that lets you, travel through a wall or something like that. That's not intended for the game to be played that way. But there are sort of these elements of the technology that can change the way that people play. So then rewards. In emergent gameplay, there are often internal economies that can be designed or emerge through the gameplay. So a lot of competitive games may have rankings. And so one of the rewards that you get for being good at the game or mastering the game is to be ranked higher. And that might also come with other types of advantages. And there's social rewards outside of the game as well. So the ranking is an example of that. If getting records for playing a game the fastest or getting the highest score, those are social rewards that are not in the game system itself, but happen in the community around the game. So example of that type of reward is special skins in Fortnite. This is kind of a new thing that a lot of game companies are using to create more rewards for the game. All right, so moving on to progressive games. And so progression again is just when there's a defined set of challenges or parts that you have to move through to get to the end of the game. And so progressive games tend to be more narrative. They tend to be longer. Sometimes there's less of a focus on action or gameplay, but sometimes it combines both. So a good example of this is King's Quest. And I like this graphic because you can see all the different screens in King's Quest. So even though it's a non-linear story, you can travel between the different scenes by walking, right, left, up, down, through the entire story. There's still a progression of story components that you have to get through, and there's no way to really, change what that progression is. There's a certain number of sort of points that you have to achieve, and story elements that you have to go through to get to the end of the game. And so King's Quest is an example of like a purely progressive game where there's not a lot of action, there's not a lot of like gameplay. It's getting through this sort of story and figuring out the puzzles and things like that. So in progressive games, we usually have levels or stages, and the player progresses through those levels or stages. They're usually tied to the fiction of the world. So typically you're moving, from one goal to the next that's tied to a story or a narrative. And the narrative in game space is expressed spatially. So there's time, but there's also space. So in a lot of like open world narrative games, the way that you explore the story is by moving between different spaces. And typically you can do that in a non-linear fashion. Like in King's Quest, we can walk in different directions, but we're still looking for the same sort of ending. Another good example of a progressive game is Undertale, a kind of recent indie RPG that's very popular. I feel like we may have talked about this before. We can take a look at the intro. So that's one example. If you're playing a progressive game, it will probably start with some sort of intro that is more of a cinematic or narrative component to the game. And so this is kind of establishing the narrative context, and then you start to move through the levels once the game starts. So progressive games are reliant on video game platforms, distribution, because they require a lot more assets. So, a game of chess can be played with just one board and a bunch of figurines, and a game of cards can be played with just a set of cards. But for a game with a lot of story and characters and narrative and different levels, you need more data to store all of that information and distribute it to players. Oops. And typically with a progressive game, rather than a strategy guide, we have a walkthrough that will actually walk us through each component of the game. You may watch a video of somebody else playing the game just to get a sense of the story, or you may use a walkthrough if you're having trouble figuring out, where to go or how to solve the puzzles or something like that. Last of Us is a good example of a game with a long walkthrough. There's a lot of levels and a lot of stages. And there's a lot of complexity to the story. You can see all of these different components, and it's an extremely long game experience. Progressive games tend to be single player, but they can be multiplayer or a combination. You could play some component on your own and then join other people to do certain challenges or something like that. And gameplay is expected to be longer, but you usually only play once. Sometimes, there might be multiple characters that you can play or something like that. But with a lot of progressive games, you're going to play through, get the story, beat all the levels, and then you'll be done. You might play it again if you really like it, but most of the time you're just probably going to play through it once. And it's typically easier to learn. The onboarding for a progressive game, it's not as dependent on, a high level of skill. At least not at the beginning. You might add skills as you kind of go, but typically it'll rely on familiar gaming conventions. Like if it's a 2D platformer, and most players will be able to just move and jump and do what they expect to do right out of the box. So a lot of times emergence and progression are used together. Progression can be used as a way to introduce complex game systems in emergent games. So an example of that would be like a tutorial. If you're going to start playing a new kind of like sandbox or battle royale style game, you'll usually start with a progressive tutorial that takes you through, this is how you jump, this is how you run, this is how you slide, all the different things, maybe some strategy as well, before you start to go in and actually, play the real game and experience the challenge. And progress is used as a resource in emergent games as well. So you might have emergent gameplay, but you level up. So you're playing the same game over and over again, but the better you get, the more resources you get, the higher level you get, the more, sort of points you might be able to use. And you also might unlock new parts of the story or new abilities or resources. These games are designed so that the characters have a certain amount of freedom, but will likely kind of encounter different parts of the story. So this is typical of open world gameplay where it feels emergent because you can walk wherever you want and you can experience these different challenges. But eventually, if the game is designed well, it's going to lead you towards specific components or, players or characters or enemies or other things to kind of eventually advance the narrative. And part of the goal of this is to balance the progressive parts with the emergent parts, so the player doesn't lose track of making progress, but they also get to do enough gameplay that they're not kind of bored with the narrative components. All right, so a few resources that I recommend checking out if you want to dive into this a little bit more deeply on emergence and progression. There's an article by Jesper Jewell, who's a game theorist who's does really great work, and it's a pretty short article just kind of defining these terms. This is a archive copy of a RPG Maker article that also kind of, has some basic definitions of the terms, some examples. And this is a PDF. Oh yeah, this is the another sort of more academic article about combining emergent and progressive gameplays into a system. So this one is a little more technical, but it has some cool diagrams and some cool definitions and stuff. So if you want to get a little bit of a deeper understanding of these concepts, these are a few good resources to check out. And yeah, let me stop recording.